So if Michelangelo's most important contribution to the classical language of architecture was the colossal order that unifies two stories of a building and becomes such an important motif throughout the history of Renaissance architecture in Rome and later and around Europe, his maybe most rigorous use of the language is the development of a minor order that complements that major order and weaves together with it. And that minor order was necessary to articulate the space of these tabernae for the guilds that have their each individual headquarters corresponding to each of the bays of the lower story of this building. That minor order is, in this case, an Ionic order. And it frames these doorways that correspond to each of the guilds. If you like, each of the guilds has its cell, its taberna, and its own individual portico articulated by 4 columns. And that unit, that is both taberna and portico, can almost be slid in and out of this building as a discrete piece. At the same time, it's woven into the building by tying into the piers on either side of the colossal pilasters. And so it's both discrete, separate, individual, and special, and yet part of and woven into the larger system, and in that sense, a repetitive unit. But the most beautiful contribution Michelangelo makes to the classical language is his Ionic capital. Michelangelo's Ionic order is a unique version of the Ionic order, a particular kind of synthesis. The proportions actually are those of the Doric order. As you've learned a little bit about the classical language of architecture, each kind of column has its own proportion. In this particular case, he's combined 2 proportions, the form of the Ionic with the proportions of the Doric, making it, in a certain way, both male and female. But we're going to talk about the capital, his most novel and beautiful contribution to the classical language of architecture. So I said this was a particularly beautiful invention of Michelangelo's. But this capital that Michelangelo invented was not just beautiful formally, in the sense that it had an elegant shape, but it was beautiful in terms of its ideas, what ideas it synthesized and combined, and in what ways it was novel and new. Michelangelo based his capital on 2 very different types. The Temple of Saturn, on the other side of this hill towards the Forum, is one of the oldest temples of the Forum, dedicated to the god who had founded his mythical city here on the hill before the founding of Rome. Again, it was also the treasury of the city of Rome. It has a very particular kind of Ionic capital. Now, the classical, more typical kind of Ionic capital that the Greeks and the Romans used had a flat volute, a volute whose face, the scrolls being the volute, its face was parallel to the front face of the column shaft. And that was the typical kind and the most common kind, in fact, almost the only kind of Ionic capital that you find in antiquity. A rare exception is the one of the Temple of Saturn, which has angled volutes, volutes on the 45-degree angle. Now, the flat kind of Ionic volute would have something on the side called a bolster, essentially the side of the scroll, sometimes looking as if it's been sort of bound up in the center. The angled volutes of the Temple of Saturn have no bolsters because they have volutes on all faces. What Michelangelo's done is essentially synthesize those 2 types. But it's not just a combination of 2 ingredients. He got something new in the process, because by combining the angled volute with the bolster, he gets a bolster that looks a lot more like a bound-up scroll, a bound-up maybe piece of papyrus. Now recall that the tabularium was the archives of the city of Rome. And for the archives of Rome, much of what they might have contained were in fact scrolls. So the scrolls recall the tabularium. They also may allude to the idea that the conservatori here are a kind of city council, but they are conservators. They retain and sustain, continue Rome by the information that they contain and the politics that they conduct. So there's a sense in which these ancient forms of writing are represented here, up on the capital of this lower Ionic order. Michelangelo's colossal order, which is sometimes called the major order, defines the kind of overall shape of the space and stitches the 2 floors together. That newness of this form gave it a sense of vitality and life. It becomes adopted around Rome. It's rarely found, interestingly, outside of Rome. It's a very Roman kind of Ionic, partly because of its association here with the Campidoglio, and partly because of Michelangelo's genius. But that genius exists in using the past in a novel, creative way to say something new without jettisoning the past, but without copying it at the same time. And that novel, creative use of the past is also operating here at the level of the piazza in the way in which he transformed the Forum into a new kind of forum space for Renaissance Rome.